If you've played even a little bit of 2v2 on the StarCraft 2 ladder, you're aware of how ridiculously prevalent that airtoss is. This is a strategy that no matter what level you play at, you're going to see so much of. This is a strategy that you can almost consider to be the norm and something that your opponent is going to do to you just almost as though it was standard and safe. The airtoss strategies are just utterly prevalent and pervasive on the 2v2 ladder. It's very interesting to note that on 2v2 ladder, you see the strategy so much more because you can skip so many things if you're Protoss. You can cut a lot of corners. Most of these players are going to skip warp gate. They're going to skip any sort of batteries or cannons. They're just going to assume their allies are doing it. And God forbid if they're two Protoss players doing the same air-centric strategy who aren't queued up together, then they're just sort of hoping the other ones are going to make something before anything in the Stargate. And a lot of these people will just mass Stargate units before they reveal them to try to get a big punch off, flying with 5 voids in the main is their idea of a wet dream. The thing that you really have to consider about these players is that they're not very good, just in general. They're so much lower level than the 1v1 counterparts, their 1v1 Protoss counterparts. Because if you take like a 4000 MMR air player on the 2v2 ladder, they're going to just basically know the abusive proxy spots, how to build shield batteries, how to be obnoxious, and how to type obnoxious things before they leave games when the proxies don't work. Whereas the 1v1 Protoss player has so many more responsibilities to deal with, and it's so much more arduous to play Protoss now than it was, say, 8 years ago. And obviously, it's way more arduous to play in a 1v1 than it is a 2v2. There are just so many more things you have to deal with. The 2v2 air player is frequently just going to go into their standard build, their 2 Stargate, straight into air units, no deviation, little to no scouting. If they do scouting, it's going to be in the form of a cannon rushing probe. And Frederick is a guy that I've played with and against quite a bit on the 2v2 ladder, and this is your typical mouthy, self-absorbed, go 2-port every game, 2 Stargate rather, player, 2-port, 2 Stargate. It's the same cheesy variation with each race. This is a guy that does this style every game. The mass cannon, no talent, can't multitask, doesn't ever deviate, doesn't really understand how the game works. And to me, this mass air style that you see from Protoss players is the only style in the entire game from any race where the players just do not seem to understand the basic mechanics of their race. These are players who are so used to stealing undeserved wins by making Stargate units that they don't really have any clue what to do. They can be vexed easily with any sort of harass that gets around them. Now, the thing about these players is they build so many cannons. That's a big reason why they're not used to harass in general, is if you spam cannons and batteries at every base and turtle and don't build any gateways so you're floating money and can just build more cannons, then you don't ever really have to multitask as far as defense goes. But what that ends up equating to is these players will build a shitload of batteries and cannons at their own bases and selfishly leave their allies hanging. So that's one thing that you can always remember, is these Arab players are going to just be selfish and leave their allies. Now what's interesting is we see that these guys are going for a little bit of double air action, so you're not going to see so much of a dichotomy, but it will serve for a nice little lesson on how to play against airtoss, which is the much more valuable lesson, because if you go into like any 2v2 game with the Protoss in it, it's going to be airtoss X whatever the other guy's doing, so the fact that they're both going airtoss will be actually more helpful as far as learning. So what are the Terran and Zergs doing in the wind-up? Well, the Terran's an idiot and I can't speak for him, but as Zerg, this is what you want to do. You want to just stick on one gas until you get Baneling Nest and Lair, and you want to just pump mass drone, get a quick third, and then you want to be liberal with your spores, because these players are going to have more air units than you're used to in your normal 1v1 games versus Protoss, because like I said, they're going to be cutting corners. A lot of them will skip warp gate, A lot of them are going to be going like 2 base 2 star and then like a late hidden third, or they'll take a hidden third as their natural and it looks like they're just a little behind. So just be liberal with the spores. It's always better to be a little bit more liberal with your static defense in 2v2, because obviously you can be 2v1'd, and with Zerg you can kind of move it around, so it doesn't really hurt as much to overmake it. But notice how after I got my lair and all that jazz going, and I got a nice little droopy saturation at this base and had drones going out to this one, I took these gases at my natural, and you want to get those mining whenever your spire is up. So whenever the spire is up, this is somewhat tricky because a lot of players will tell you, you of course do want to get the upgrade straight away, but there is sort of some debate on what you want to do with the muta production. Because if you're playing a 1v1 and say you're going 2 hatch muta, like a cutthroat muta focus build, yeah, you want to get the mutas out as soon as the spire finishes. But if you're playing in a 2v2 macro game like this, you might want to get a few other things before you really make all your mutas, whether it be a macro hatch or a couple evo chambers or a 4th base. And a lot of that has to do with the current threat on the map. What do we see on the map here? It's your typical turtle toss, where they're just trying to make air units. And if you look at this setup, we have mass stargates and fleet beacons out. So if I run my mutas across the map, it might look like, oh, he just has a couple voids. Well, he can easily make Phoenix with range, so it's not really going to be a threat. Whenever you want to do the muta rush and to go into your opponent's base when they're Protoss, is whenever they go Robo or Twilight, and it's very hard for them to deal with the mutas in their base. Phoenix and the Stargate counter mutas. So if your Protoss opponent opens Stargate, all of a sudden it becomes less of a priority to make mutas. Especially if you're in a 1v1 and it's like, oh, I can make 5 mutas. Do I run in right away with the 5 mutas if he's making Phoenix? No, it won't do you any good. Wait till you have a few mutas. And we can see that's what I did in this game. I'm going to wait until I have a nice little amount of mutas, 14 mutas, before I finally go in. And because I know my opponents are going for a double air composition and they're both being very abusive, I'm foregoing ground upgrades and getting a second Spire as my +1 carapace, or +1 attack rather, for air is about to finish. So this is a typical thing that you see from bad air players, is the spamming and over-reliance of static defense but inability to actually structure anything properly as far as SimCity goes. And here my terrible ally is floating about 1k minerals, the amount of money needed to get enough marines out here to actually threaten. And he wasn't really anything more than a nuisance, but I ran in there and sniped that hilarious 1 pylon 3 cannon entrenchment. And as we see mutas fly in here and are going to try to get something done, it's very hard whenever people set up cannons and batteries. It didn't used to be this difficult. As we see, a big pylon snipe goes down there. Now he can't really reinforce or anything. That would be big if there was a follow-up army. But back in the day when the mothership core existed before the shield battery, mutas were way better at running in and harassing Protoss. Now, if you just mix in a battery at every base, it's really way easier to defend. The battery and cannon combo accounts for basically like 2 pylons and 3 cannons, it feels like. Because you can't really run in and snipe anything with authority. That's what batteries prevent, is sniping stuff. That's the whole fucking point of mutas. Yeah, you might be able to get a couple probes, but what you really want to do with mutas is run in, get the static defense, whether it be the cannon or turret, and then run out and hit somewhere else, and then when you stab back in, you sort of make the wound fester. And the red Protoss player is going to attack here. Frederick, this is the guy that I knew would go air, and we're going to see what happens. And unfortunately, the corner base here for me doesn't have spores set up, although I am doing a pretty diligent job getting creep spread up to it. And I am double upgrading, which is extraordinarily important when both players are going air, because the Protoss air units are just going to be better than yours and will out-trade you. So 2 things are important to note here. Mutas are good because they can actually threaten the stuff on the ground and they do their little bouncing glaive damage, but they're not very good at straight up fights. So whenever people are going heavy air, you really have to favor corruptors because they're way more tanky. Now the interesting thing is that corruptors are sort of useless for everything but just killing stuff in the air. So that's a big reason why people open Muta, but Mutas aren't very good for fighting. So the real crux of the issue here is whenever you fight versus someone's air, you always want to like lead with the corruptors and do the main damage with them, and then sort of come in with the Mutas. The Mutas just aren't that good at fighting, and it's really brutal to see players that play with like mass cannon styles like this with batteries, because you see a lot of this type stuff happen where it's not as easy as it used to be to dip in and get damage done. Now that he just has a handful of ranged Phoenix, remember he lost a big portion of his army, now it looks like I've lost all my Mutas, and his upgrades are actually pretty good, and we see a bit of a mothership coming here. And the corruptors are really the Zerg unit that allows you to come in and do the heavy duty anti-air fights. The Mutas are more of a harassment unit that gives you more utility. Another thing you have to consider is, as Zerg, there are two things that help you immensely versus Protoss Air. That's the Infestor with fungal and neuroparasite, and I guess microbial shroud, even though it's a joke. But more importantly, the Viper with parasitic bomb and the abduct ability. A big way that you can avoid getting steamrolled by Protoss Air is when you have these stalemate fights and your army's parked outside their base and you can't do anything. Use the abduct ability to pull 3 or 4 carriers and focus them out. That will force the air player to do something. The Viper is pretty damn hard to micro and sort of a pain in the ass. What we see here from Savagewood is more of a focus on the upgrades of the Spire units and transitioning into corruptors, and this is a pretty simple micro tactic. Whenever your opponent has ranged Phoenix, if you just follow them, they're going to be able to kite you infinitely. So you want to do two things. Put pressure out on the map via ground, because a lot of times if someone's making a bunch of Phoenix, it's because you just showed Muta, and they're not going to have stuff that can shoot up. And then what you want to do is focus fire one, and then when they fire, run away until they get disinterested, and then double back on them, and then snipe them. You don't want to get in an involved, elongated fight, but like right here, whenever I ran in and killed his third, if he was out on the map, maybe I could run in and get on top of his army and get some extra shots off. So right here, this is a great example of the scared, talentless air player, floating a bunch of money, just making a bunch of panic cannons and batteries, and here his ally is out on the map trying to get something done, somewhat formidable. And unfortunately, I'm going to try to counter because I've killed this base and I'm sort of looking at here like, well, what do you have? And thankfully I'm going to run over here and help my ally. So as the link, this is why I wasn't really microing the links, because as that's going on, I'm focused over here. Notice the corruptors are 2-1. That really does make a world of difference whenever you're doing these fights, because the carriers do so much more DPS than you, and you have to be careful not to just get utterly lit up by the Archons and not sit and storm. Those are two things that will just absolutely embarrass you if you're trying to rely on this corruptor style and you're just standing under storm and Archon splash. All of your corruptors will disappear in a matter of seconds. You can't sit there and do a bunch of Shift A commands on the carriers and be like, okay, now I'm gonna sit. And you have to be willing to attack, move, and it's not the sort of fun like marine micro that other players get to do, but as Zergs, it's what we have to deal with. And this is another annoying portion of the game, is as I've consistently been attacking this base and destroying it, this air fucker has been attacking this bottom left base despite my spores. And here I bring the corruptors over, and it looks like Frederick is going to lose a hefty amount of air, and Night Knight is going to try to defend this on the other side of the map. More Void Rays come in, but the bottom left portion of the Protoss army will be cleaned up. And it looks like Night Knight will defend with some Thors. Thors, of course, are pretty damn good against Protoss if air is mixed in, because they can do this, not the shitty Thor Javelin mode, but the bonus damage to big stuff mode, and it's actually a pretty good threat versus carriers. Obviously this guy Night Knight's pretty dim-witted, so he's not going to do it, so I'm going to have to come over and clean up the carriers myself, which really is the only reason that that bottom left base died, is because I'm over here having to hold Night Knight's Chode the entire time. And we see even here he's unable to do with the handful of stalkers, and I have to send in a swell of lings. Now when you go for this style where you get multiple spires and focus on air upgrades and really get mass corruptor after mutas, you're really assuming both players are going air focused. You can't do this if one guy is going like mass Archon or there's a Terran going mass Marine, because this army is really only good against toss air, and even then you have to have something else to complement it. And since running into batteries and cannons isn't that good, what you're really better off doing is like just counter-attacking while you fight, or having spellcasters that lock this stuff down like Infestors or Vipers. That's why Infestors and Vipers are so good, is they prevent you from just being infinitely kited. So whenever you do this style and you sell out for mass air, you're sort of saying to yourself, well, I'm Zerg, I have worse anti-air than Protoss and Terran, but if I skip my Evo chambers and delay them and get this double spire and actually get up to a quick 2-2, get a shitload of corruptors, I can do this, kill his air quick, and then just do mass caustic spittle on his bases. It really does feel like corruptors are worthless, but when you have this many, you can just run in to weird little angles like this that he doesn't have cannons at and caustic spittle it down and be like, there goes your base. And if you do that once or twice, after killing a lot of air army, the air player will just sort of be sitting there with his dick in his hand, unable to truly stop you because of the rapidly scaling nature of the damage. Night Knight is making a base over here. He has one over here. Notice the creep spread is mediocre, but most importantly it's forking down into my bases. I was actually very diligent not to foul up his area and spread over here. A lot of time when you play with random allies, you just sort of have to say to yourself, well, I'm not going to creep spread in their way. I think I killed one of my own creep tumors in this game. But interestingly enough, we're going to see a little punch in here. So it's very important to know what to do whenever your ally gets attacked in 2v2, because this map is huge. It's a great example, but even on small maps, if your ally gets attacked all the way on the east side of the map and you're on the west side and even your ally's on the west side, the dumb thing to do is run all your shit over, because then his base is already going to be dead by the time you get there. Protoss has recall, they can run away if they have a brain, etc, etc. So what do? Do you keep attacking? What do you do? Because you obviously don't want this guy to just keep fucking pushing and ruining your ally's day. So we have to sort of think here and take stock. Our +1 is about to finish for our air, so that's good. We're not going to get dumpstered by Protoss's air, and the only reason we don't have +3 armor is because we got a greater spire. So we have the ability to go Broodlords, which is huge when you do this style, and is the entire fucking point of making the second spire. Those 1-1 and 2-2 upgrades are big, but really when you make a shitload of corruptors, there does have to be an end game for it, and you might as well be able to go straight into Broodlord. Because you have to imagine in a 2v2, if you have 20 corruptors and 10 Broodlords, and God forbid a couple spellcasters, your ally can pretty much have anything and what's going to kill your army. It's also good to always make an Ultra Cavern whenever you go for these air styles. That's just an old school Zerg tactic that will help you whenever the opponent does a switch. You can switch into Ultra and fuck them if you want to. Notice I made a Matchcore hatch, and I've been fighting for this bottom left base that's been heavily harassed. I'm going to take a quick drink here. Remember, my 2-2 is late because I went for double spire straight into air. This is a huge point. If you're a Zerg player and you made it to this point in the video, this is going to help you win a lot of games. If you know a Protoss player is a straight up, always 2 Stargate, abusive ass, air only player, the way that you beat them is you yourself rush straight into Spire, and in this case in a 2v2 double Spire. You don't waste your time getting +1 Carapace first, or Burrow first, or a bunch of shit you don't need, double Evo upgrades, fast Hive. No. You get mass drone, because the Stargate can't kill you early if you just spore up a little. Make that lair with the minimal amount of gas you're mining off one geyser we see now that's mined out. And then whenever the spire is like 3/4 of the way done, you get your gas online. That's a beautiful little tactic that'll help you stop airtoss players. Whereas the way you're going to lose the airtoss players is if you put one foot in and out of the door, is if there's an enemy Zerg that's like Ling flooding the shit out of you, putting Ling Bane and Roach pressure on, and he's killing your third and screwing you around, and suddenly 6 voids show up in your base. When both of them are going airtoss, it actually makes it easier, because you can just stack things that counter airtoss. Widow Mines, Thors, Vipers, Infestors, stuff like that. It's very hard to micro both Infestors and Vipers, but if you can pull it off, you fungal the carriers and parasitic bomb them, that's a lot of damage. Another way you can do this, if you have an intelligent Terran ally, which seemingly on the 2v2 ladder, no one's capable of this, but your Terran friend can mix in a couple ghosts. A lot of these Skytoss spamming players never mix in an observer unless you're just constantly killing them with cloak stuff. They'll begrudgingly mix in an observer then. So your Terran buddy goes ghost, cloaks him, sneaks up on this goofball army and EMPs all these shields down. Remember, EMPing 150 shields off is huge. Suddenly then your fucking corruptors can come in and really actually compete with the Protoss. So ghosts are good, infestors are good, but what ends up happening is players just try to go Hydra, then they have 20 Hydras, which are absolutely worthless, and then they're even worse than that if they get split up. So you're really just better off going Mass Corruptor and then delaying it and going Lings and Ultras after. Unfortunately, Lings really thrive whenever you get upgrades, but you sort of forsake that with the style. Notice here the Protoss player is attempting to defend his base with all the static, and I'm just running in and fungling what he has as I'm helping my Terran. Now it's always tricky. It might seem like, oh, you gotta come back and defend, you gotta come back and defend. This guy has recall, and he knows that, so you sort of have to say to yourself, like, when is that, when do I really have to defend, and how much do I leave on their side of the map? Notice I sniped this base with Corrupt, and this base is gonna die too, and this base should die. So the Protoss is starting to push, and he's punched out a Terran base. He had made this one float, obviously. And here we see me coming in with Lings to help, and watch this Gosu move. I fungal all the shit, and here I'm gonna fucking take his own High Templar and storm his own army. How fucking awesome is that? All the High Templar gone. That's some baller shit. Meanwhile, across map, they're taking devastating, game-ending damage. But that was really cool to see a High Templar mind control to storm out the rest of the High Temps. I'm making Ultras to try to combat the ground. +3 air carapace is starting, and 2-2 ground is almost done. That's a huge fucking upgrade. Remember, Lings and Marines are some of the most upgrade reliant units in this whole game. Let's rewind a bit here. Okay, so all this good stuff happens. So he's going to run into the minefield and just recall. Okay, that's what I thought happened. So then the Terran player is forcing his way into the main. When you're in this situation, it's like, what do I kill? Cybercore is always extremely high priority because it limits what they can warp in. And then if they're air players, you want to go for the Stargates and the pylons powering the Stargates. And remember, if you kill the Cybercore, they can't get air upgrades, and if you kill the Stargates, they can't remake them till they remake the Cybercore. Also, the Forge against these abusive air players is pretty funny because then they can't make cannons, and a lot of these abusive air idiots won't make enough fucking gateways or even get fucking Zealot charge to be able to properly play a mobile game. As we see, Savagewood is going to run over here and stomp this out, and look at this, he's actually going to take over a probe and make a nexus, and look at this, the enemy nexus gets cancelled, and Savagewood is going to make a nexus of his own, which essentially means that once this finishes, Savagewood, as the Zerg player, will be able to start making Protoss units, which is hilarious and something that we almost never see because of how uncommon it is. But because the red Protoss was trying to take this base right as Savagewood ran over, as Savagewood gets the other base as well, Savagewood is able to yank a probe and build right in that beautiful spot. You know, rarely are your opponent's probes right where you can build them in the nexus spot next to minerals. That's very, very rare for obvious reasons. And when you have this many corruptors, you can sort of just boss in right over their base in a couple cannons and say fuck it and just two-shot the carriers. And Terran players, whenever you play with the Zerg player, all of Zerg's units are bio, so you should make extra medevacs, because a lot of the stuff that Zerg can do is really, really obnoxious with a few medevacs. Just right-click a couple medevacs on your Zerg's units and it will just help them a ridiculous amount. In the same way that everyone has been vexed by a drop that they are just pulling units to kill and can't kill because the units are being healed, a few Zerg units with heal mixed in. It's just disgusting. And Savagewood here is going to crush this base. This is another bread and butter tactic to defeat air players, as we can see. Desperation DTs coming in as Savagewood is dealing game-ending damage. One thing that players will do at the end is to just try to kill you with DTs. It's simple, just make sure you're already going to have spores at your bases because they're going air, but obviously this base was consistently attacked. You just suck and shift click a few units out of here, out of your control group over to the bases, and you just spine each base. It's very simple. Whenever you're this deep into a base trade, a few DTs isn't much to deal with. If these DTs were 3 minutes earlier and I was getting destroyed by them, yeah, it would be a big deal. But see, if you just leave one ultra and you have static detection, it's not that big of a deal. Also, obviously build overseers, because one trick they'll try to do is kill your hive or lair and then you can't have mobile detection, and then it really is weird. So we win, blue team wins. Let me just close with a few thoughts. So this base was consistently attacked, sure, but since I knew that, I was diligent about spreading creep up to this high ground. And when I saw the DTs here, notice I didn't lose all the drones, and I made an overseer, and there were plenty of spores here, and I'm making a spine, because if you have multiple spores that they can't focus out, the 1 or 2 spines in one unit like an ultra makes this just a bitch to really backstab and not really able to be backstabbed. And remember, I made all these corruptors, ran in like Rambo, sniped all the air, caustic spittled down all the stargates, and then said, alright, well, you don't have air units, time for broodlords. And I made some 3/3 broodlords. And to close, I just want to say that this Frederick guy is a mouthy little rodent, and we have each other blocked, and he goes air every game. And my ally, for whatever reason, had me blocked this game, and I didn't have him blocked. And I like sent him a nice message after the game. I didn't know he had me blocked, and it was like, oh, he has you ignored. And then a minute later, he had like unblocked me and sent me a message that was like, I love beating air kids, GG. I was like, alright, I guess he doesn't hate me that much. But once you do run in and snipe the air units, and then snipe their ability to make air, the broodlords become like the best unit in the game, basically. If they can't make air, the broodlords are gods here. And remember, the broodlord upgrades here at the bottom, the attack ones are based off of how much damage they do whenever they first land and hit, and the Evo chamber upgrades are applied to the broodlings that are on the ground already. So like if you have +3 broodlords, when that first little volley of broodlings goes off, like that right there, that right there, that right there, the damage that that deals is based on these air upgrades, and the damage that these little broodlings based when they gnaw is based on your air upgrades. Anyway, just remember that if you're facing airtoss and you're Zerg, you do want to go for this, and you just want to sell out completely, like, oh, they're going air, or it's double air, or maybe the Terran's going BC, the toss is going air. Double spire, get double upgrades just so you can keep up. Maybe open muter to put pressure on, because if you just go open straight corruptor, it's sort of like too defensive. But it's a very effective little tactic that can help you get into 3/3 and actually stay on pace to help you get into spellcasters. Sub for more, bell notification too.